Report 1. It was supposed to be an ordinary night. My friend Tiago and I decided to camp near a swamp a few hours from home. The idea was simple: escape the routine and enjoy a bit of peace in nature. But that night, we discovered that peace was the last thing we would find. The swamp was known for its tranquility and unusual beauty. During the day, the scenery looked like it was taken from a painting. Calm waters, the constant sound of frogs and crickets, and a breeze that swayed the trees in an almost hypnotic way. We chose a secluded spot where we could set up our tent and light a campfire without being disturbed. We arrived at dusk, and the first hour went exactly as planned. Simple food, good conversations, and the cool breeze of the swamp around us. However, as soon as the sun began to hide, the atmosphere changed. Silence arrived quickly, as if someone had turned off all the sounds of nature. "Did you hear that?" Tiago suddenly asked, interrupting our conversation. I hadn't heard anything, but his expression made me uncomfortable. He insisted he had heard something moving in the water, something heavy. We decided to investigate with the flashlight. The water was still, and the light's reflection revealed only submerged branches and floating leaves. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Still, the discomfort grew. Back at the campfire, we began to hear strange noises, snapping branches, muffled footsteps in the mud. We tried to convince ourselves that it was just animals. It was the kind of thing you tell yourself to avoid going crazy. Around 2 a.m., the noise got closer. This time it was clear. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from somewhere beyond our line of sight. Holding the flashlight with trembling hands, I pointed in the direction of the sound. There was nothing, just twisted trees and shadows. We decided it was best to lock ourselves in the tent. Inside, the silence was almost unbearable. But then we heard something that chilled us to the bone. The sound of heavy breathing outside. It was close, very close. Tiago looked at me with wide eyes, as if expecting me to have an answer for that. Gathering my courage, I opened a small zipper of the tent to peek outside. The flashlight illuminated the shimmering water of the swamp, and that's when I saw footprints. Barefoot human footprints imprinted in the wet mud, but there was no one around. "Run," I whispered to Tiago without hesitation. We grabbed our things as fast as we could and started making our way back to the car. The footsteps behind us quickened. There was no doubt someone was following us. We reached the car without looking back. As we sped down the road, I swear I saw something in the rearview mirror. A figure standing at the edge, motionless, watching us disappear into the night. Since that night, I have never gone camping again. I don't know what was following us or why. What I do know is that the swamp may hold secrets that should not be uncovered. Sometimes the greatest terror is not what we see, but what we feel without explanation. Relato 2. It was an ordinary weekend when I accepted my cousin Luana's invitation to accompany her to her family's house in a remote swamp. The place was isolated, but she swore it was peaceful and perfect for relaxing. I decided to go. I had no idea that this trip would completely change the way I perceive silence. The house was about a 3-hour drive from the city. The journey there was already unsettling. Dirt roads seemed to narrow as we went, trees so dense they blocked the sky, and a humid air that felt sticky against our skin. We arrived at dusk, and I must confess the house had a rustic charm. It was small but cozy, with a porch that faced directly onto the swamp water. Luana explained that the property had been bought by her grandparents many years ago, but no one from the family had been there for a long time. It was filled with dust and cobwebs, but that didn't bother us. In the first moments, everything seemed calm. We sat on the porch, listening to the sounds of nature around us. Frogs croaking, birds calling to each other, and the sound of water moving almost imperceptibly. However, as soon as the sun began to set, I felt something different. The swamp seemed more quiet. "Do you think anyone has been here recently?" I asked Luana, looking at the dark water. "I doubt it. The house was locked when we arrived, and no one from the family has come here in years, she replied, unconcerned. I brushed the topic aside, but a sense of unease began to settle in. That night would be long. When darkness fell, we decided to explore the small trail that ran along the edge of the swamp. Luana brought a flashlight, and reluctantly, I followed her. The air was heavy, and our footsteps made noise on the damp ground, breaking the absolute silence. We walked for about 15 minutes until we reached a point where the trail seemed to disappear into the water. There, I felt something strange, as if we were being watched. Luana's flashlight illuminated the trees around us, but all I saw were twisted trunks and the dark water reflecting the lights. Suddenly, we heard a sound, a loud crack, coming from somewhere to our left. It's just an animal, Luana said, trying to sound calm. But the sound repeated, this time closer. Something large was moving through the swamp, but we couldn't identify what it was. We decided to head back to the house, walking fast. The further we moved away, the more that feeling of being watched grew. Back at the house, we locked the door and sat in the living room. The flashlight was on the table as the electric light didn't work well there. We were talking, trying to ignore the discomfort when the sound returned, but this time it was coming from outside the house. It was the sound of footsteps, but they weren't like ours. They were slow, almost calculated, and seemed to be moving around the house. I grabbed the flashlight and went to the window. Luana grabbed my arm, telling me not to look, but curiosity was too strong. I pointed the flashlight at the porch. There was nothing there. I breathed a sigh of relief for a moment, but then I noticed something that made me freeze. There were footprints in the mud leading up to the porch steps. Large, bare footprints and clearly recent. "Let's get out of here," Luana said, almost whispering. I agreed, but before we could do anything, we heard another sound. Something was tapping on the window. It wasn't a strong knock, but more like someone was lightly scratching the glass, testing it. I moved closer, trying to see through the curtain's gap. There was nothing, but the sound continued, and then, out of nowhere, it stopped. We decided it would be better to wait inside until dawn. We locked the doors and sat together in the living room, trying to stay calm. But the silence was oppressive. Even the sounds of nature had disappeared. Shortly after, we heard footsteps on the roof. Something or someone was up there. Luana began to cry softly, and I tried to stay calm, but my heart was racing. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen, knowing it was useless against something I couldn't even see. The footsteps moved slowly across the roof, stopping right above us. We were completely silent, trying not to make a sound. For a moment, I thought it might be a large animal, but then we heard something impossible to ignore, a heavy breath. The breathing seemed to come directly from the ceiling, as if someone were leaning in to listen inside. Seconds later, we heard something sliding down the outside of the house, moving down the walls. We were paralyzed until suddenly the front door began to tremble. It wasn't a knock, but as if someone were trying to turn the doorknob. I ran to the door and pushed the table against it, while Luana held the knife with trembling hands. The next minutes felt endless. The noise stopped, but the fear remained. We sat on the floor, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. Around 4 a.m., silence returned. I looked out the window again, and the swamp seemed normal, as if nothing had happened. When the sun finally rose, we grabbed our things and ran to the car. When we were far away, Luana asked, "Do you think it was someone?" I didn't answer. To this day, I don't know what it was. We saw nothing, but we felt it. Something was out there that night, something that knew we were alone and vulnerable. I never returned to the swamp. Luana sold the house a few months later. I still dream of that sound of footsteps on the roof and the weight of that breath. Whatever was watching us, I'm sure it's still out there waiting for the next visit. Account 3. I have never been a superstitious person, but something changed in me after that night in the swamp. The silence I felt there still haunts me, a void so deep it seemed alive. It all started when I accepted a temporary job as a nature photographer. An old friend, Eduardo, called me to help him capture images of a conservation area in a remote swamp. The place was little explored, and the idea was to photograph the fauna and flora for an environmental project. We arrived at the location in the late afternoon. The swamp was dense and humid, with twisted trees rising like claws from the saturated ground. There was a small wooden cabin at the center of the reserve where we would spend the night. The air had a strong smell of decaying vegetation, but the scenery was fascinating in the daylight. Eduardo seemed excited, but I already felt something strange. Maybe it was the weak wind making the leaves sway irregularly, or the constant sound of water moving, even when everything else seemed still. As soon as the sun began to set, the temperature dropped and the swamp sank into an almost absolute silence. It was as if life itself had decided to hide. Eduardo and I were outside the cabin, organizing our equipment, when we heard a distant sound. It was hard to describe, like a low moan coming from the direction of the trees. Eduardo laughed and said, "It's just the wind, or maybe an animal. Relax." I wanted to believe that, but the sound didn't seem natural. It continued, as if something was whining deep in the woods. I decided to ignore it, but my whole body was tense. When night fell, everything became even stranger. We decided to explore a small nearby trail to capture nighttime images. Eduardo, always fearless, led the way with a flashlight. I followed closely, trying to ignore the sound of our footsteps sinking into the mud. It was then that we noticed there were no animal sounds anymore. No frogs, no crickets, nothing, just our footsteps and the occasional splash of water. "Have you ever seen a place so quiet?" I asked. Eduardo shrugged, but I noticed he was nervous. We continued walking until suddenly he stopped. "Did you see that?" he asked, pointing the flashlight toward a group of trees ahead. I didn't see anything, but he swore something had moved between the trunks. A branch broke to our left, and we immediately pointed our lights in that direction. Once again, nothing, but the silence felt heavier, almost palpable. We decided to return to the cabin. With every step, I felt as if we were being followed. It wasn't paranoia, it was a clear sensation, as if something was watching us closely, but remaining out of reach. When we finally arrived, we locked the door and turned off all the lights, trying to convince ourselves it was just our imagination. We sat at the cabin table, whispering about what we might have seen. Eduardo started to laugh nervously, trying to relieve the tension, but his laughter was interrupted by a sound that froze us completely. It was the sound of footsteps outside, slowly circling the cabin, heavy footsteps sinking into the damp ground. I looked at Eduardo and he was pale, holding a kitchen knife as if that could protect him. The footsteps stopped in front of the door. We froze, holding our breath. Then something began to scratch at the wood of the door, as if testing its strength. Eduardo turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the door, but I quickly urged him to turn it off. "We don't want to attract attention," I whispered. The scratching stopped, but we heard another sound. Something or someone was whispering. We couldn't understand the words, but the tone was low, almost gentle, which made everything even more terrifying. I decided to peek out the window, even though every fiber of my being screamed not to do it. I slowly stood up and looked through a small crack. There was no one, but on the ground, barefoot prints were embedded in the mud, coming and going around the cabin. Eduardo finally lost his patience. "Whoever you are, go away!" he shouted, banging on the door hard. An absolute silence took over the place. For a second I thought it was over, but then we heard something. A horrible sound, as if something was being dragged through the water, coming from the direction of the trees. It grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be right outside. Suddenly the entire cabin began to shake. It wasn't a strong tremor, but as if something was lightly pushing against the walls, testing its strength. Eduardo grabbed my arm, his eyes wide, and whispered, "This isn't human." I wanted to disagree, but I knew he was right. After what felt like an eternity, the sound stopped. We sat there until dawn, not moving, not daring to make a sound. When the sun finally rose, we cautiously stepped out of the cabin. The footprints were still there, but now they led toward the water, disappearing into the mud. There were no signs of anyone, but I knew something, or someone, had been there. I never told this story to many people. Eduardo refused to return to the swamp, and neither did I. To this day, I try to understand what happened that night. Maybe it was a local playing tricks on us. Maybe it was something worse. The only thing I know is that the silence of that swamp was not natural, and I never want to experience it again.